For years, Officer Renner thought he could get away with anything, especially when it came to women who looked like Eleanor Price. He saw a young black woman alone on a park bench and assumed no one would listen, that she wouldn't fight back, that her silence would be his shield. But he was wrong, because Eleanor wasn't just another name he could brush aside. The voice was that Eleanor Price was the daughter of Mayor Nathaniel Price, one of the most powerful voices for justice in the city. What happened next wasn't just a reckoning. It was a mirror held up to an entire system, one that had protected men like Renner for too long. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you're watching from and make sure to subscribe, because the story you're about to hear isn't just about one woman. It's about all of us. Sunlight filtered through the willows of Lincoln Grove Park that day, casting soft shadows across Eleanor's book as she turned each page. The air was still, calm, until two officers walked up and shattered. It was a soft Sunday afternoon in early September, and Eleanor Price sat beneath a willow tree in Lincoln Grove Park, her eyes dancing across the pages of a novel she had read a dozen times before. The breeze carried the scent of cut grass and old roses, and for a moment it seemed the world had paused for peace. Then, out of nowhere, a voice split the air. "Hey, sweetheart, that's a mighty fine dress. Mind if we take a closer look?" The words didn't just disturb the silence, they fractured it. Eleanor froze. She wasn't a teenager. She was 28, a community organizer, a woman used to speaking in front of city halls and crowds. But now, alone on a park bench in a flowing ivory linen dress, she was just vulnerable. Two police officers, both in full uniform, were striding toward her. The older one, plump, red-faced and smirking, had clearly been the speaker. His badge said J. Renner. The younger one, lanky and uncertain, followed closely, eyes scanning Eleanor like she was merchandise behind glass. Eleanor stood, spine straight, but heart racing. "Can I help you with something?" she asked, her voice steady, though her fingers clenched around her book. "Oh, nothing official," Officer Renner replied with a grin that reeked of disrespect. "Just thought you might be hiding something under that pretty dress. You girls always got secrets." Before she could react, he reached out with his baton, not to strike, but to lift. In one grotesque, shocking motion, he flipped the hem of her dress, exposing her legs and more, right there in broad daylight. Laughter erupted from both men, that cruel, echoing kind that carries weight and shame. "And Eleanor?" she gasped, yanked her skirt back down and staggered backward, her cheeks burning with humiliation, her dignity crumpled like fabric in his hands. How is it that a badge meant to protect can be used to violate? How would you feel if your granddaughter stood in Eleanor's shoes that day? She didn't scream. Not yet. There was too much disbelief. Instead, a single tear slid down her cheek as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. And then, slowly, rage started to rise. Quiet but unstoppable, like thunder rolling in from the horizon. Eleanor didn't run. She didn't scream. She just stood there, her breath shallow, the echo of their laughter still dancing cruelly in the air around her. The younger officer, his nameplate read T. Mason, shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the path, maybe checking for onlookers. The older one, Renner, still wore his smug grin, though a flicker of unease tickled his brow. He hadn't expected her to look him in the eye. "You have no right," Eleanor said, voice low, trembling but firm. "This is assault." Renner scoffed. "Lighten up. It was just a joke. No harm done, right?" "No harm done?" Eleanor's hands clenched at her sides, the fabric of her dress still rumpled from the intrusion. Every part of her body felt watched, violated, as if her very skin no longer belonged to her. But worse than the physical act was the knowledge that they didn't care, that her protest was entertainment. Who are we when those meant to protect become the ones we fear? "I want your badge numbers," she said, stronger now, right now. Again that mocking smile. Or what? Renner sneered. You gonna tell your boyfriend? Post about it online? Good luck. But Eleanor didn't flinch. She reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. Her fingers were trembling, not from weakness, but fury, held barely in check. Her thumb hovered above the screen. "Don't be stupid," Officer Mason muttered, taking a step forward, glancing nervously around. "There's no need to make a scene." As if it hadn't already become one. Eleanor looked past them at the trees swaying gently in the breeze, at the small fountain where children played, unaware. Something shifted in her. Not fear, not even anger. It was resolve, steady, still, like roots digging into earth. What would you do if your silence meant more women would suffer? She didn't cry. Not anymore. She took a breath, deep and full, and raised the phone to her ear. Her voice was quiet but unshakable. "Dan, it's me. I need your help." The moment Eleanor spoke into her phone, the entire tone of the park shifted, at least for two people. "Dad, I'm at Lincoln Grove, near the fountain," she said steadily, though her throat was tight. "Two officers just assaulted me. They lifted my dress. In public. On duty." On the other end, a pause, thick and heavy. Then, a voice like steel wrapped in thunder. "Are you hurt? Stay where you are. Hand the phone to the officer. Now." Eleanor stepped forward, holding the phone out toward Officer Renner. He laughed, a short, nervous bark. "What is this, a prank? Who's on the line? Your lawyer?" "No," she said simply. "My father, Mayor Nathaniel Price." The color drained from Renner's face so fast it was almost comical. His smirk vanished like a curtain yanked back to reveal fear. The name hung in the air like a verdict. Even Mason looked stunned, blinking rapidly as if he'd misheard. Mayor. Her father was the mayor. The man who had championed police reform, stood on stages with civil rights leaders, passed laws protecting the very rights they had just trampled. Why do some only see humanity when power enters the room? Renner took the phone, hand trembling now. Yes, this is Officer Renner, sir." The moment the mayor's voice came through, it was as if gravity had doubled. Renner's knees locked. His eyes darted around for an exit that didn't exist. "You assaulted my daughter," the mayor growled. "Do you understand what that means?" There was no arrogance left in Renner now, no smirk, no words, even just a frantic nod and a flushed face. "Can you imagine the shame of being stripped of your power not by force, but by truth?" He handed the phone back like it burned. Mason looked pale and sick. And Eleanor? She stood calm, taller somehow, her breath steady. For the first time they saw her not as prey, but as someone they should never have touched. And it wasn't because she was the mayor's daughter. It was because they finally realized she mattered. Within 20 minutes of Eleanor handing the phone back to her father, sirens wailed low in the distance, urgent but not frantic. 3 unmarked cars pulled up along the edge of Lincoln Grove, tires crunching softly on the gravel path. Out stepped a half-dozen figures in dark suits and uniforms, their faces hard with purpose. Leading them was Deputy Chief Eleanor Park, a woman known in city halls for her calm steel. She walked directly to Eleanor, not to the officers. "Miss Price," she said gently, "I'm here on behalf of the department. I am deeply sorry." Behind her, Officers Renner and Mason stood stiffly, their earlier swagger shattered. They hadn't moved since the call ended. They knew, and now it was time to pay the price. What does it feel like to watch justice arrive, not with shouting, but with certainty? "Officers," Chief Park said, turning to them, "you are hereby relieved of duty. Remove your badges, weapons, and step back." Renner looked as though he might faint. Mason fumbled with his belt, lips quivering. They obeyed, slowly, as if removing pieces of themselves. When their badges clinked onto the pavement, the sound was small, but it echoed loud. Park's team collected witness statements while Eleanor sat beneath the same willow tree, her back straight despite the storm inside. She watched them work. Measured, professional, transparent. It wasn't healing, not yet, but it was something. Can real justice ever undo what has been done? A bystander approached her, a retired teacher who had seen everything. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "We saw it, all of it. If you need someone to speak up, I will." Eleanor smiled faintly. "Thank you," she whispered, as Renner and Mason were escorted away, silent, pale, no longer in control. Eleanor didn't gloat. She didn't even watch them go. Her eyes were fixed on the badge left behind in the dust, its shine dulled by truth. Sometimes justice doesn't roar. Sometimes it simply arrives. News of what happened in Lincoln Grove didn't stay quiet for long. By sunrise the next day, whispers had turned into headlines. Mayor's daughter assaulted by officers during patrol, badges stripped after public incident. What once might have been brushed aside became a fire too hot to contain. Inside police precincts, officers gathered in hushed corners. Some shook their heads, some clenched their jaws, and some, finally, looked inward. The story traveled not just through ranks, but through neighborhoods, church pews, barber shops, and dinner tables. Eleanor, meanwhile, kept her routine. She returned to the office at Bridges Forward, the nonprofit she co-founded to fight injustice. Colleagues embraced her, bringing flowers, hugs, and quiet tears. She smiled, but her heart was still heavy. Not for herself, but for every woman who never got a phone call answered. Do you know someone who never got the chance to be heard? What made Eleanor's case different wasn't just who her father was, it was that people listened. That truth came with both gratitude and guilt, because for every Eleanor, there were hundreds who vanished into silence. Mayor Nathaniel Price stood before City Hall that week, his voice firm beneath the cameras. "This isn't about Eleanor," he said. "This is about a culture that must end. Abuse of power is not just a betrayal. It's a wound to the very soul of our city." Behind him, Eleanor stood tall, not as a daughter, not as a victim, but as a witness to how quickly injustice spreads, and how firmly it must be stopped. The officers were gone, yes, but the deeper work was only beginning. Can a city heal if it only treats the surface and not the root? Change, she knew, wouldn't come overnight, but in every conversation that sparked from her story, in every person who paused to reconsider what dignity really means, a seed had been planted. And seeds given light do grow. A week after the incident, Eleanor found herself back under the willow tree in Lincoln Grove Park. Same bench, same soft rustling of leaves, but nothing felt the same. She sat with a small notebook in her lap, blank pages waiting. The spot once marked by fear had become a place of reckoning, of power. She wasn't just there to remember. She was there to write it down so no one would forget. And what happens when a woman reclaims the space where she was once humiliated? Across the city, reforms had begun. The police department launched mandatory retraining on ethics, anti-bias practices, and community accountability. A citizen review board, one Eleanor had quietly pushed for, was suddenly back on the table. The mayor's office released a public apology to the women of the city, acknowledging what so many had endured in silence. And yet, Eleanor knew better than to see justice as a finish line. Some people called her brave, others said she was lucky to have a father in power. But she didn't feel brave, and she certainly didn't feel lucky. What she felt was responsible. For every young woman who didn't have someone to call, for every voice still waiting to be heard. How many voices do we ignore because they don't come with a title or a spotlight? She closed her notebook after the final sentence. I stood my ground, not because I wasn't afraid, but because I knew fear couldn't have the last word. As she walked away from the bench, she looked back, just once, Not with sadness, not even with anger, but with clarity. The tree still swayed gently. The wind still moved through the branches as it always had. And now, because one voice had been heard, perhaps others would be braver to speak. Because real change doesn't begin in a courtroom. It begins in someone's heart. Life lesson. True dignity doesn't come from power. It comes from standing firm even when you're afraid. Sometimes, justice begins with just one voice saying, "This isn't right." Eleanor Price didn't raise her voice because she was fearless. She did it because her dignity mattered more than her fear. In a world where silence can be safer, choosing to speak, even when your hands tremble, can light the path for others. For many of us have lived long enough to know how often people in power get away with doing wrong. We've seen it in headlines, maybe even in our own lives. But this story reminds us that even in the face of injustice, courage still lives. In small acts, in calm defiance, in telling the truth when it's easier to look away. You don't have to be the mayor's daughter to make a difference. You just have to believe that every person deserves respect. And when someone is brave enough to stand up, perhaps the rest of us can meet them there, with belief, with support, and with a shared hope that the world can be kinder. One voice at a time. Eleanor never needed a podium to be powerful. Her strength wasn't loud. It lived in her stillness, in the way she sat, again beneath that same willow tree, not as a victim, but as a woman who survived, who spoke, and who was heard. No crowds gathered, no applause rang out, but something had shifted. Healing had begun, and in its quiet way, it was every bit as mighty as the storm. What came after was not swift, but it was steady. Reforms were written, trainings enforced, stories uncovered. Eleanor worked not to erase what happened, but to make sure it meant something. The pain had a purpose now. The silence that once threatened to smother her was replaced by conversations, commitments, and slow but real change. If this story stayed with you, share it. Subscribe to Echoes of Racism so these voices don't fade into silence. In the meantime, I've chosen 2 stories I think will move you just as much. Take care, and we'll see you soon.